Welcome to this rapid revision session on Diem's Vietnam. No Dinh Diem. That's my best go at the Vietnamese pronunciation, so sorry if it wasn't brilliant. But let's have a look at his government and how it was structured. In October 1955, Diem became the head of the South Vietnamese government. He was not well supported because the referendum he won against Bao Dai had been rigged with US support. There were lots of communists in South Vietnam. He was a Catholic who favoured Catholics. Most Vietnamese were Buddhist. This is one of those rare occasions where a minority is persecuting the majority. Diem gave jobs to his own family. That's a process known as nepotism. He was based in Saigon, in the city, with little understanding of the lives of the peasants in the villages, which again is the majority of Vietnam. Diem refused to hold elections in 1956, fearing that he would lose. The USA backed him, fearing that the communists would win. So let's have a look at examples of Diem's oppression. Diem held on to power against great opposition. He had begun to arrest political and religious opponents in order to try and hang on to power. He introduced a Denounce a Communist campaign, which urged people to report communists to the government. Indeed, people would report neighbours that they had grudges against, not just communists. In 1957, he sent the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, into the countryside to find and arrest communists. You might view this as being the start of search and destroy tactics. 65,000 were arrested, and around 2,000 were killed in these operations. Although Diem's government started out under the same time as President Eisenhower, one of the presidents who had the most significant dealings with Diem in his government was President Kennedy. So let's have a look at his approach to Vietnam. By 1961, JFK was president and Viet Cong attacks had become a serious threat, and Diem wasn't coping. There were over 12,000 Viet Cong fighters. Half of South Vietnam was under at least partial control of the communists. Kennedy wanted a change of tactics. There were two strands to this. A. Use ARVN, with US support if necessary, to hunt for and destroy the Viet Cong. This would later become search and destroy. And then B. Win over the hearts and minds of the villagers and pacify them. In other words, make them peaceful. Make sure that they supported the government and not the communists. However, that was easier said than done, given the persecution of people like the Buddhists by Diem. Kennedy's priorities were even harder to achieve because of worsening oppression against Buddhists by Diem's government. As a bit of background, at the beginning of 1963, Diem's position had got even worse. ARVN soldiers with significant US support had lost the Battle of Ap Bac. This was despite them outnumbering the Viet Cong 5-1. 60 troops had been killed, as had 3 US advisors. 5 American helicopters had been shot down. As a result of all this, only 3 Viet Cong fighters had been confirmed to have been killed. This was a very one-sided battle, and a humiliating defeat, which did much to further undermine people's faith in Diem, both his own generals and the Americans. But rather than change course, persecution of Buddhists intensified. 9 Buddhists were killed and 14 were injured when ARVN soldiers fired at a Buddhist procession. Buddhists were forbidden from flying flags on the Buddha's birthday, and Buddhist temples were raided. Perhaps most shockingly and most famously, on the 11th of June 1963, monk Quang Duc burned himself alive in Saigon to protest how Diem treated Buddhists. The image I've censored in this particular slide here, and earlier uploaded this, therefore got taken down because of that particular content. Which is a bit of a shame because it is important sometimes to confront the more horrifying and more shocking elements of history. This image was absolutely iconic, and it was important too. Not only was it shown around the world on newspapers and on the television, but it helped highlight the plight of Buddhists under Diem's regime. It showed how unjust he was, and this put the Americans in a very difficult position. They were claiming to be the land of the free, and they were fighting for freedom in South Vietnam by supporting Diem's government. But this became harder to argue when it became clear to the rest of the world just how Diem was treating the majority of his population. It was hard to argue that communism was evil, when so much bad was being done in South Vietnam too. Let's have a look at the fall of Diem. Diem had taken American money, American resources, but had ignored their advice. By the autumn of 1963, Diem had lost the faith of the US government and of his own generals. On the 1st of November 1963, ARVN troops under the command of ARVN generals, and possibly with CIA approval, stormed Diem's palace. Diem was shot dead, and ARVN General Minh was put in charge of the country. Not to be mistaken with North Vietnam's Ho Chi Minh, I should say. The USA knew the plan, and they did not warn Diem. So clearly, a moment of regime change was desired by the US government. So what next? At the start of November 1963, President Kennedy's new priorities were to influence the new South Vietnamese government to act democratically, and also to help the new government win over the people of South Vietnam, an ideal opportunity now that there was a change of leadership. They also, therefore, hoped to be able to withdraw US advisors and other forces as soon as possible. So what went wrong? On November the 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, shown on the right there being sworn in aboard Air Force One with Jackie Kennedy, President Kennedy's widow, stood next to him, he would inherit these tasks, and therefore he could actually adopt a different approach. What would have been done with Kennedy's aims, we'll never know for sure. How much Lyndon Baines Johnson carried on Kennedy's approach, again, we don't know. But the war was soon to escalate. Some final points then. From 1955 to 1963, South Vietnam was run by the government of Ngo Dinh Diem with US support. Diem did not run Vietnam democratically. He was seen as a puppet of the USA and disliked by many Vietnamese people. He persecuted Buddhists, who were the majority of the Vietnamese population, and he didn't understand the lives of ordinary Vietnamese people. Kennedy wanted Diem to reform, but Diem was killed in an army coup in 1963. Kennedy was also assassinated before his reforms could be introduced with the new government. And that brings us to the end of this brief summary of Diem's Vietnam. I hope it's been useful, and if it has, please like the video and consider subscribing to the channel. It all helps. If it's something that you're desperate for me to do a revision lesson on, put it in the comments below and I'll see if I can bump it to the top of the list. Thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.